So hello, everybody. My name is Nicole Kittle Broe. I'm the current localization manager at Snap.com. We make Snapchat. I come to you from the world of film and television and games and now tech. I've worked at Blizzard, did some time at Netflix, Riot Games, where we worked on League of Legends, if you know anything about gaming, Paramount Pictures, and then did a stint in storage networking, where I learned more about replicated CDNs than I thought I would ever need, and I use that knowledge every day, which is a lesson in never wasting an educational opportunity. So I got started in localization when I was at Paramount Pictures. I was what was known as their fun sucker, which was an unofficial title given to me by a director who shall remain nameless. It was my job to take the nudity and swearing out of film so that it could be shown in the airlines, I'm dating myself here, in the airline cabins and on television. And of course, many of your spidey senses may be tingling on the localization front. I had to do a ton of conform work. And so that's where I fell in love with the localization industry and the folks that are in it. So that's me in a nutshell. I'm here today to talk to you about reinventing an enterprise localization ecosystem on the buyer side. I am what is known as a disruptor in this industry, and I'm brought in to table flip an ecosystem when it's not optimized, future-proofed, scalable, or sustainable. So that's kind of my jam. I've done this a few times, and I've noticed a few trends, and I've learned a lot from this industry, so at some point, I think it is necessary to put back into the coffer of knowledge, so here I am today to do that very thing. All right, so I don't take every opportunity that comes my way. I like really specific ones, the really juicy ones. A juicy opportunity to me is typically chaos up front, and so what happens is there's a reorg or a departure, and a new executive inherits localization and says, oh my gosh, this is not optimized, right? But this executive doesn't have experience in the localization industry, doesn't know how to fix it, doesn't know what's wrong, and so they look for someone like myself, and that's how I usually end up sitting across the table from them. I know that an environment is primed for disruption if they ask me a couple different questions. First, the advice on process and workflow. If they whiteboard their entire process and say, I don't know where it's broken, what do you think? And then there's a bunch of manual steps, I know that I can really help them. And the second thing is they ask for my opinion on the evolution of the localization industry, which is executive code language 4, is machine translation ready yet? To which I say no, and then I manage their expectations, you're welcome localization industry, and then I talk to them about how I could actually potentially help them on this front, machine translation aside. Okay. I lean heavy on tech solutions. You'll have to excuse me, my notes are over here, so I might do a little awkward back and forth for a bit. I lean really heavy on tech solutions. Okay, so let's talk about some quick goals. So say I take the gig. All these goals won't be unfamiliar to you. We're shooting for sustainability, scalability, of course, cost efficiency, and the right quality. I think the question of quality is a threshold. I don't need the same level of quality on my customer support content as I do on my UI content. That's not a new concept, that's pretty standard in our industry. But I do have to kind of socialize that with executives. And then of course, there's the ubiquitous good, fast, cheap model. So I use different parts of my ecosystem to kind of get success in each of those buckets, which again is not revolutionary, but just a good level set, if you will. All right, oh, sorry. Got excited. All right, let's talk about phases of disruption. So there are 3 really basic phases encapsulated here on this slide. So the first is to listen and learn. I'm gonna dig deep into each one of these. The second phase is to make a plan with your team, with in capital. And the third phase is to execute, which is again really basic. So let's get into the details. So the first phase, there we go, is to listen and learn. So in this first couple of months that I joined the company, I don't do a lot of talking. I don't talk about my past companies, my past experience. I just spend a ton of time collecting information, which is typically not what they're expecting. They're waiting for me to come in and just start breaking dishes right away. Don't worry, the dish breaking happens later. This is where I learn the players and the products, the teams, the process, the workflow, and one of the most important things I have to learn is the constraints they were under when they built the ecosystem that they have. If I walk in, I can usually tell within a couple of days some things that probably need to be fixed. But I have to respect the history of the team, and that really means that maybe they have really manual processes because they never had engineers, right? So I have to really make sure you respect the context of how they got there and all that history. And I take a lot of time to do this because I'm trying to build trust. This is the foundation for everything I'm trying to do in the future. And so I really have to make sure that I present myself as a pliable resource to them and not someone who's just going to tell them that they're wrong. So this is where I build a ton of trust and a feedback culture, which is crucial to being able to do this well. I need to be open. I remain open as someone who is willing to take someone's feedback when I'm proposing breaking all their dishes, for example. All right, so this never takes me less than 3 months. It depends on the cadence of the product that I'm shipping, but 3 months always feels a little bit comfortable. I work on a bi-weekly cadence now, so I can see the product go through many iterations before I decide on the changes that probably need to be made. All right, phase 2 is making a plan with your team. Successful disruptors inspire change, they don't drive it. I can come in and I can make a plan for how we should work and operate, but really the actual change that I need to affect is a change in mindset on the team that I'm inheriting. I'm typically inheriting a really tactical team, and I need to shift them to a strategic mindset. So the key in order to do this is I leverage a chartering offsite, which I could do an entire presentation on about how to do this well. But I take my very tactical team and I put them in another space, and I call that the strategic space. So, and I invite them to be strategic at pretty much like an all-day session. And in that session, I ask a lot of questions and tell them that the goal is to walk out of there with a solid end state that we all agree on. Like, what is the North Star that we all want to work towards? And that comes into play hundreds of times in a given period of reformation, because I'm constantly measuring their current activities against the end state. Does it get it closer to the end state? So I ask a lot of questions in this offsite, and then I ask them to come up with everything that's wrong with what's happening right now in their workflow. And it's a great rapid ideation session with a ton of Post-it notes everywhere, and we group that work into pillars, columns of work, so tools, data, and that's how we know where to focus and how to focus. Again, constantly mining for dissent inside the team, and because this is where I start to kind of raise my voice and say, okay, you've made a great plan here. Let me fill the gaps with some of the knowledge I have from my previous experience, and I have to do that very delicately because this has been their world for some of them many, many years. They've created this ecosystem. So I'm mining for feedback and for dissent. So phase 3 is to enact my master plan, or their master plan. And I kind of mentioned these before, but when you do the offsite, there are 6 areas of reformation that always come to fruition. That's kind of a little bit of a secret to the sauce, because it's this big revelation in the room when you group all of the sticky notes and you're like, oh my gosh, we have to fix tools. Oh my gosh, we have to fix data. This is pretty standard. And the best way to handle this is to delegate ownership of each of these pillars to individuals on the team. Remember, I'm trying to further cement this shift in mindset from tactical to strategic. So I give them ownership of these pillars in singular form and say, hey, you're in charge of driving success in the tools front or the vendor front. For me, I typically take team and data because executives are coming to me asking for data, so it makes sense that I drive that, and I am probably trying to manage people as well. That's usually part of the job, so it makes sense that I'm handling things like growth for the team. Okay, so I want to dive into each of these pillars, but first I want to make a controversial statement. Localization is not a service. Localization is an intricate part of international product development. So this may or may not be controversial, but inside a company that has always thought of localization as a service, this is kind of a moment where they pull back, right? I think if we're doing localization at the end of the process, this is not a foreign concept to any of you probably in this room, you're too late. Many companies think of localization as just translation, and I actually have to train them to think a little bit differently about that and encourage upstream engagement for my team. Okay, not controversial? Anybody bothered by that? All right, so talking about the pillars, real quick on the tools front. Standard issues that I see, a lot of manual integration. My folks are touching translation requests all throughout the process. They haven't had a lot of engineers, so they've had to work harder. They haven't had the chance to work smarter, right? And companies like to build proprietary tools, which is really hard on localization because they don't build in proper API functionality, and I can't connect to their tools, I can't pull data. It's super frustrating. So I end up talking a lot of other teams out of the proprietary tools that they've built along the way. It's disruption all around, folks. My objectives in this space, or the objectives of the person who is driving this pillar even better, are to enable continuous localization, pretty standard, right? And an exception-based workflow. I'm usually inheriting a team of project managers, and I am encouraging them to stop project managing and to work upstream. It is terrifying for them. I'll talk a little bit about that later. All right, on the team front, I want to talk about objectives first. So when I first joined a team, I spent a lot of time with my full-time employees, deep into empathy with them, understanding who they are, where they want to go in their careers, where they've been, and whether or not they want to go on this journey with me, because I'm about to change everything, like pull the rug out from underneath them, right? So I revisit titles. I typically inherit project managers, and I turn them into producers. And this is because I want to put them on the same footing with game producers or feature producers, because I want them to have a seat at the table. That's a slogan of mine, is always producers sit at the table. And so I change their title typically, and that encourages that tactical to strategic shift. It changes how the organization sees them as well. I have to right size the team. I might inherit 5 project managers, 15 project managers, but I probably need a data analyst, I probably need an engineer, and I probably need maybe like a localization quality assurance program manager. So I might have to swap some headcount. I got to socialize that stuff really early with my executive leadership, because we do headcount once a year typically. And again, I'm working really hard with them to establish this feedback culture. So in all of my one-on-ones, I ask, what can I do differently? What can I do more of? What can I do less of? And then I go silent, and I don't let them out of the room until they give me something. And it's super mean, but it works. Okay. So some of the issues that I typically run into, I mentioned some full-time employees may not want to go where you're going. So that's something that you have to consider, and be really honest with them. Like, hey, if this isn't a fit for you anymore, like maybe I got to find something else. That's really hard. Dig into that empathy to message that. The team is typically, when I inherit them, really been unsupported for a really long time. They don't have any sense of career progression or growth in their careers, and they're really frustrated, so morale is terrible. This has happened to me multiple times, and so I've had to do a lot of work on that front. And again, that paired with the fact that I'm changing everything by coming into the company, rampant toxicity. So that feedback culture is really important to have to mitigate against that. On the data front, walking into the environment, typically I don't have any data. I don't have any data analysts. I don't have any engineering support to connect the tools to get data out of the tools. And the worst case of all, sometimes I have really, really bad data done wrong. Data and data analyzation is a discipline all in its own, right? And so when folks try to do it themselves, plucky as they are, often the data tells the wrong story. You can make data tell any story you want. You all know that, right? So here's how I handle this. I socialize the need for support really early, because again, headcount comes once a year. But then I have to do this tricky thing where I build a rudimentary data methodology, because even though I've told my executive I need data analyst support, they inevitably would come to me in 3 weeks after I've joined and say, okay, how are the metrics? And I'm like, remember, you haven't given me a data analyst yet. I don't really have the metrics. I just got here. So it's really important that I socialize the need for that support early. And again, we're all trying to understand quality, throughput, and cost. Pretty basic. On the vendor front, this is where you can really make or break your team. You have to be really careful in this space. You have to make sure that the disruption here is really purposeful and not personal, and you have to make sure your team is on board. More than likely, they've been working with their vendor for a while. They're probably comfortable with them. Maybe they have some loyalty and friendships, right? But if you look at the new vendors and your old vendors and you find you need to move away from the current vendor, you have to be really delicate about how you do that and make sure they're along for the ride. So when I look for vendors, I look to partner with entities that fill gaps in my resource pool. Remember, I don't have a data analyst. I don't have an engineer. I probably don't have an LQA program manager. Every vendor comes to me and says, we have the best translations. And I say, you're all pulling from the same translator pool. What else you got? What else you got to make yourself stand out? So I prefer to partner with forward-thinking entities. A lot of translation vendors will say, here's our great project manager. And I'll say, that's fantastic. Can this person use Jira? And they say, no. And I say, okay, that is not helpful to me, right? Because I am inside Jira and I need to make sure they're trained on the tools that I'm using on a daily basis and staying up to date with that Atlassian knowledge. And the final thing is I partner with entities who can deliver feedback. Remember, that's really important to the disruption phase, is having that open channel. And I also have a really tactical team at this point, right? So I need strategic partners, and I have to find them, and I usually find them at my vendor, so I look for feedback from them. On the process front, again, it's really manual. There's a lot of email. There's a lot of spreadsheets. This is the world I usually walk into. There's no automation. And when you make any changes in this space, there's rampant panic inside the localization team and outside. Everyone is terrified that you're going to break all of their dishes all at once and they're not going to get their stuff on time. I actually think breaking things is a great opportunity to understand where something is unsustainable or unscalable. So I love when things break. That's an opportunity. So having my team shift their mindset on that front is really important. The objectives in this space are always to enable exception-based workflow. Again, I don't want them touching the things. I want them working upstream with product teams to prevent internationalization errors and localization errors. Socialization and education. Oh, I want to say one thing about this. This slide is really lean, and I'll tell you why. Because in the future, my team is not going to spend a ton of time here. The execution of localization and the delivery of translation is not my team's core function. I want my team's core function, because they're sitting with, next, and near to the developers, to be to help them build a globally resonant product. They can't do that if they're moving files back and forth. So the files need to flow without my team touching them. That's really important to stay. Come on. All right. This is where I want my team spending their time, on the socialization and education pillar. Localization inside most of the companies I walk into is thought of as a service. They just throw it at the back end. They huck their product over the wall. We throw translations back at them. And I want to get the entire company out of that mentality and to see us as partners and to let us in the room really early during the ideation so they don't make an entire product full of skulls that I can't ship in China. Happens to me all the time in games. There's a lack of understanding of how the discipline can be of service to the product teams, and I work to really solve that. That's what this pillar is working to fix. So again, we're trying to work upstream to prevent internationalization and localization errors, and we're teaching product teams to embrace the global ownership of their product, because they often think that English is done and subsequently they are done, and that is not the case. How long does this take? Typically, it takes 1 year. This is pretty standard, regardless of the size of the ecosystem that I'm reinventing. And that seems like a long time, and it is, but disruption is by nature very disruptive. And so you want to make sure you don't do too much at once. I've done this in 6 months before. I wasn't everyone's favorite person in the room. There's a better way. Take your time. This is really hard work, so I make sure I take as much time as I really need. Okay, where should localization live? This is a big debate in our industry, right? Oftentimes we're partnered with QA. That's because QA also ends up being at the end of the process. Poor souls. I have a lot of emotions and partnership with QA, but they are a bit of a 500-pound gorilla, and they have their own issues to solve. So I don't think this is a great place for localization to live. I think it's a good place to incubate, but I think moving out of that space is a really good idea. Now, another place localization can live is in international. And here's how your team will talk about international when you first start a company. They'll say, those are just those guys that have MBAs and fly all over the world and come back and tell us what language to localize. That's not a really good opinion to have of your team members, right? And so part of my job is to actually help them see this team differently, because they have exactly the same goals as my team. So I'll typically go become best friends with the person that runs that team and present to both of our teams together as a unified entity. We are working together. That's a really important relationship to fix. The last place localization often lives, where I've seen it live, is in product, and this is the gold standard for me. I absolutely want it to live in product because it gets me in the room. Otherwise, I get this, oh, this meeting is just for our team. But now you can't say that to me because I'm on your team, right? I put myself in your team. So I like to put localization there. Other key partners, information technology, IT, legal. In the process of disruption, of course, I'm embarking on tons of new contracts, or I am asking a company to let contractors sit at home in far-flung regions of the world, which they have never had to solve for permission schemes before, for IT, right? So there's lots of work to be done with these folks. I buy them lots of wine, sometimes other forms of booze. Yes, that's very important. So just one quick final thought. this is something I've stumbled on multiple times, is I've walked into a company before that hasn't had company-wide alignment on the international initiatives. And that is super frustrating in a couple of different ways. First of all, it's not articulated as important, and so when you're trying to do things in the localization space, you'll get the message that, hey, this isn't important, this is an executive goal, like I have other things I'm working on. So you really want to make sure, I always make sure, that you understand what the international strategy is really early on, and that you actually have a seat at the table for this discussion. And if it's not happening, then I get to spark the debate, which is really great. And I also really need executive buy-in, right? I need executives standing on stage talking about the importance of growth in international markets, because I can take all of my goals and tie them to theirs, right? And say, oh, but so-and-so said this is really important. Our CEO is talking about it. You should really consider partnering with me on this. It's sneaky. It's all disruption is sneaky. All right, so that's about it. You've learned all my secrets. This is a quick cheat sheet for the presentation. So just remember to focus on scalability and sustainability. Respect the history of the team. Inspire the change, don't drive it. Feedback culture is really important. I always use an exception-based workflow, which is counterintuitive to most localization practices. I don't touch the things. Don't touch the things. Use the technology to touch the things. Get your team to engage upstream, because Loc should be a partner to product. Put your producers, not project managers, in the product team, and lean really heavy into socialization and education, and take your time. And that's it.